In this video, we're going to take a look at writing a paper, specifically creating an outline for your paper. Making an outline for your paper is one of the most important and helpful pieces of planning you can do to make sure that the rest of the process goes as smoothly as possible. So first, we got to make sure that we know what an outline is. What do I mean by that? It's a really important piece of the planning. In my opinion, every time you write a significant paper, you should do this work of creating an outline. And basically what it is a series of brief statements, usually they're in point form, and those statements map out in order the structure of a paper. Each component and what it's going to actually look like, what information it's going to contain. If you do this work, proper planning upfront prevents making mistakes later. It's going to save you time in the long run, even though you're doing a little bit more work up front. And it's going to really ensure that your paper stays on track in terms of being the correct length, staying on topic, doing what it's supposed to do. So what does an outline contain? Typically, there's kind of three sections to the outline. Your first point is always going to be your introduction, because every paper needs to start with a proper introduction. The introduction is going to introduce the topic that you're talking about and the thesis. The thesis is always going to be the last sentence of your introduction, okay? So your introduction, you're just going to generally talk about your topic and what it is, and not really get into detail or explore nuances. And then once you get to the last sentence, it's just going to be thesis statement that you end on. So by the time they reach the end of your introduction, your reader should know exactly what the topic is and what you have to say or what you're arguing about your topic. Then the next 3 points are going to be supporting points that help to prove or defend your thesis. You can do more than 3 supporting points. 3 is kind of the classic structure. You should have at least 3. 1 or 2 supporting points is frankly just not enough. And each supporting point should come in its own paragraph. After your supporting points, which provide the body of your paper, the real meat of what you have to say, you're going to arrive at the conclusion. Your conclusion is always going to be your last paragraph of your paper. It's going to be the last point in your outline. And really, when you're making an outline, you can just say conclusion, because the conclusion doesn't do anything new. It's not going to contain any new information. It's just going to summarize and wrap up the paper. So what does this look like? Usually an outline looks something like this. Classically, people use Roman numerals for their points. You don't have to, you can just use numbers or letters. But you can see that the first point is the introduction, okay? And we know what the introduction is supposed to do. That always comes at the start. Point number 2 in your outline is going to be point number 1 of your paper, right? Supporting point number 1. The third part of your outline is going to be your second supporting point. The fourth part of your outline is going to be your third and usually final supporting point. Of course, if you have more supporting points to add in, you're going to need to write in more points to your outline. And your last point, your fifth part of your outline, is going to be the conclusion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, very neat, orderly outline. Sometimes there's more supporting points that you can add in. But basically what this work does as we do this planning is it gets us thinking about not just our topic and our thesis, but what are the supporting points that I'm going to spend time on and actually use to help prove or defend my thesis. Where am I going to want to spend my time? What do I have enough research and information to prove? So you're probably going to want to be doing some reading and research as you're crafting your outline to help you narrow down what your supporting point should actually be. So let's take a look at a sample outline. So this is for an actual topic and actual thesis. You can see that point number one, as it should be, is the introduction, right? That's where the paper is going to start. I've taken the time, this is a good idea, to include my topic and my thesis just as subpoints right underneath my introduction. These are notes for me down the road as I'm writing my paper to keep my introduction focused, to remind myself of what I'm actually writing about. So in this case, my topic is anxiety. I'm writing a research paper about anxiety, and even more focused than that, I'm going to focus on strategies to help deal with anxiety. So that is going to be a reminder for me to help keep my paper really focused. Anytime I start talking about anxiety and I'm getting into other things like root causes, where does it come from, or even symptoms, what it looks like, I'm getting a little bit off track. Now, when I'm writing my introduction, I'm probably going to provide some general information to introduce what anxiety is and what it looks like, but I'm not really going to get in depth with those things. That's just introductory stuff. On top of my topic, I need to have a thesis, a really pointed focus for my paper. What am I saying specifically with this paper? What am I trying to prove or defend? In this case, I've come up with the following thesis statement. People have the ability to manage and reduce their anxiety through targeted interventions. So basically what I'm trying to prove with this paper is that individuals can actually do things. They can take concrete steps to address anxiety if it's something they're experiencing in their life. So all of my subpoints should really be supporting this thesis, that there are real concrete steps that you can take to address anxiety. And I'm just going to provide examples and ways that that can happen. Now let's start to take a look at my subpoints. These are points 2, 3, and 4 in the outlines. And you can see as I've done my research and looked at different ways that people can use strategies or interventions for anxiety, I've noticed or I've come up with kind of 3 categories for these interventions to fall into. Physical health categories, a mindfulness category, and a relational category. These are 3 general types of interventions that you can use to help address anxiety in your life. And so I'm going to be talking about different interventions in different sections depending on what categories they fall into. So this is just a strategy that I've come up with to help organize my paper so it's really clear what I'm talking about in each section. And the only reason I've really been able to come up with that organizational system is because I've taken the time to work on an outline and think about, hey, what sections would make sense? What categories should I use to help form this paper and defend my thesis? And you can see that I've actually included subpoints for each of these points because I want to make notes for myself what I want to talk about in each section. If you're going to add in subpoints, you should have at least 2 or 3 subpoints for each section. If you've just got one subpoint, that's not worth adding in as a separate subpoint, right? Really, you should only start listing subpoints if there's more than one to list. So for this first category, physical health interventions, I want to focus on 2 different areas. I want to write a bit about exercise. I want to write a little bit about nutrition. 2 things that you can focus on for your physical health that are going to help you with anxiety. I'm going to talk about strategies that you can use with exercise and nutrition and how they're going to impact your anxiety directly. And I'm going to need some research to actually prove that, right? So I'm going to need resources that help me make those connections. But these are going to be the sections or categories. For every point or subpoint, I'm definitely going to want to put it in its own separate paragraph. And that's an organizational thing, right? To keep my structure nice and clear. For the second category, mindfulness interventions, I've actually come up with 3 interventions. And so there's 3 subpoints here: breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, and practicing being present. Okay, again, I'm going to need research and resources behind each one of those points. I'm going to need to put each of those subpoints in a separate paragraph. Okay, you can see how it's really important to draft and work and rework your outline as you're doing your initial reading and research, right? Those two things go hand in hand, because the reading that you do and the information that you find is going to directly impact the content of your paper. So if you find that you really want to make a point, but you are unable to find the resources to do so properly, you're going to need to restructure your paper. For the third category of interventions, relational interventions, I've come up with 3 subpoints again: family, friends, community, and culture. I'm going to need a little bit of research behind each one of those. Each one should be in its own separate paragraph. And as always, my final point in my outline is the conclusion. And I don't really need extra notes for that. Conclusion's a summary. I'm not stating anything new. This is a good example of what a sample outline looks like. Okay, I've got intro, 3 supporting points, each with subpoints, and conclusion. And it's point form. It doesn't say anything more than this. It just helps to guide so that when I actually start writing my paper, I can stay on track and work on each section. Tips. When you're creating your outline, something that I really like to do is pencil in how many words I need for each section next to the section based on the paper length. Okay, so let's say I need 1,500 to 1,800 words is a pretty standard, actually a fairly short university paper. I would probably structure that along the lines of this, maybe 200 words for my intro, 500 words for each point that I'm going to make, and 100 words for the conclusion at the end. Okay, that tally already brings me up to 1,800. So that can add up pretty fast. But just by making that note, it helps me as I'm writing to remember how many words did I want in this section. And it kind of guides the amount of time and space that I'm giving to each point that I'm making. When you're making your outline, as you're ordering your points, make sure that the order of information makes sense. Now, in this case with my anxiety example, it didn't really matter which category went where. They're all separate categories. They could really go in any order, I feel. I chose to put the relational interventions last because now you're starting to look outwards and focus on your connection with people around you rather than just internally. So to me, it made logical sense to put that one at the end. But you want to think about, as you're creating your outline, is there a logical order or sequence that these points need to come in? Do you need to understand one first before another one? Are they sequential? Does it transition or flow nicely to put them in a certain order? Okay, so those structural things are things to think about as you're making your outline. As you saw in my example, you can add in subpoints for each of the supporting points. You could even do subpoints for the subpoints if you want. Generally, the longer the paper is, the more you want to structure it with points and subpoints, just to keep yourself on track and fill in what you're going to be doing with all of those words. Another thing you might want to do, in addition to paying attention to the word count when making your outline, you also might want to pay attention to the sources that you're using. So like I say, you're often going to be doing the reading and researching while drafting your outline. And while you're doing that, you might want to make notes about which sources to use where. So, oh, this website that I found really works well for point number 3. This source really ties into point number 4. So it's going to be helpful if you make some notes for when you're writing. As you're structuring it and working through the outline, you can go, oh yeah, I was going to use this source for this point. That's where I'll look as a refresher. Of course, you should be making notes while you're reading and doing research and pulling from those as you're doing the actual writing. You can use numbers, letters, or Roman numerals to order your points. That's an aesthetic thing. It really doesn't matter. But you should use some kind of system to keep it structured and organized. I would definitely use something sequential like numbers or letters rather than just bullet points, right? Which don't have a sequence or order to them necessarily. Ask your teacher for an outline form. Lots of teachers do have them on hand and will provide them. And that's basically an outline that's left blank, and then you just fill in the blanks. And that can be a helpful tool to use to create this outline, especially when you're beginning. Creating good outlines takes practice, but it is worth it for structuring a good paper.